once again to part two of Church Incorporation. Travis Story and I. Travis is an attorney in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and he's active in the church market, faith-based sector in helping churches and organizations stay out of trouble. And I'm with the Center for Church Risk Management, Education, and Training, a division of Mike Russell and Associates. What we're talking about today is Church Incorporation. Now, this is part two, and we're going to talk about how the IRS looks at an organization. Do they even qualify as a church? But we want to talk also, Travis, about are there any disadvantages of being incorporated? And I think we should talk about what kind of cost is involved. How long does it take for a church to be incorporated? So why don't we just take it right there?
Well, let's talk about the process. The process to be incorporated is fairly easy. Typically, that can be done in less than a couple of weeks. That's to be the actual incorporated church, to have the nonprofit entity set up. Then there's a second layer that some churches elect to do, which is to actually file for the 501c3 status.
Isn't that the same?
It's not the same. See,
Right.
Often people say, all I
Right.
have to do is get a nonprofit corporation.
Right.
That does not mean you have your 501c3 status with the IRS. That takes a separate filing that you have to do after you've done all of the incorporation
How
paperwork.
many times when I ask a church, are you incorporated, they will say, well, we're a 501c3.
Well, you can't be both.
But you know.
That's the deal.
Yeah.
That's one of the differences
Yeah.
of being incorporated versus being unincorporated is an unincorporated entity can't be a 501c3. Now, that doesn't mean a church couldn't also receive tax-free gifts if they're an unincorporated association. And a lot of times unincorporated associations use somebody who they're affiliated with and say, we're going to use their tax number. And that's kind of how they think they're a 501c3. But they have never received the actual determination letter from the IRS.
Very important.
And that is huge because that is the one piece of paper. It's very underwhelming when you get one. But that's the thing that says you are a 501c3. It's also the thing that adds you to the registry where all of the websites that deal with, charitable giving start actually being able to rate you.
Okay, let's we have a church that wants to become incorporated. Mm-hmm. What is the first thing they do? Let's go back over that again.
The first thing they have to do is say, we're willing to be incorporated.
Now, does that mean that the pastor says it, or does it have to be a church vote?
It typically comes down to whatever's in their constitution at the moment.
So
we've got to look at each church individually and say, what does this mean? And as you well know, Mike, there's different kinds of churches. There are churches that are very congregational based. There are churches where kind of the leadership is vested in the trustees or elders, and you kind of get a little bit of everything. And one of the things we have to figure out is kind of who the leadership of the church is. And then ultimately that leads to the vote. Oftentimes it's a vote of the congregation.
What if a church does not have a constitution?
Well, one of the things that we have to do oftentimes, and I've had to do this before, is literally we have to say, here is the Constitution. We are either coming together under a Constitution or we are going to get everybody to vote and say we are all going to be the incorporators of our nonprofit corporation. So you've got to have some authority somewhere. And if that means that ultimately the church as a body is going to get together and do that, we're going to have that be a big event. And once that happens, we can actually form the nonprofit corporation.
Is there a disadvantage? So the first thing to do is look at the Constitution. What does it say? Where's the authority? Where do they get their authority to even make the decision to become incorporated? Who's going to be the spokesperson? Who's going to file the papers and so forth? And the church has to make some further decisions.
They have to decide who they're going to be, and then they have to decide how they're going to operate. And one of the disadvantages a lot of times that I see is actually later on when a church starts operating under a set of bylaws and they're not operating under...
And we haven't even gotten there
We
yet.
haven't even gotten there, but they're not operating under what they say they are. True. And there's some big issues with that. Some of the other disadvantages are, one, we have cost. It definitely costs more. Just filing with the IRS is an $850 fee. So to a small church, that can be a lot of money. And that's one consideration that you have to take into account is that something we want to do? Now, I would argue that the benefits far outweigh the costs, but that's definitely something that especially a new church who's getting into this, saying, hey, we're going to start our own church, we're doing a church plant. cost is a big issue. It's not uncommon to, be a few $1,000s to actually do all the paperwork, form it, and then you've got the IRS $850 fee. So, it can get expensive real quick.
But there's LLC, there's incorporation, and what's the big difference?
Well, the big difference is an LLC isn't a nonprofit corporation. The nonprofit corporation is the only one that can actually get the 501c3. So a lot of times you hear an LLC, okay, well that's fine, but that's not an entity that really qualifies because we've got to have the structure in place.
But there's a S corporation and a C corporation.
Well, and both of those are great for profit entities.
Okay.
They're not nonprofit entities that we would put set up a church in.
Yeah.
And so those are really hard because a lot of times what you don't hear is the nonprofit corporation. Everybody hears, oh, I see an LLC, I see these big companies, and they're, the ones on Wall Street, they're all C corporations. Okay, that's fine. That doesn't matter. We have to be a specific nonprofit corporation that then goes and files for the 501c3 with the IRS.
Okay, what kind of cost? You mentioned, $850 to the IRS, but what does it cost for an attorney to prepare these papers?
So depends somewhat on the state that you're in and the costs that are associated with the filing of the nonprofit corporation. So that's always the caveat. Depending on the state you're in, you're going to have different costs. Typically, I would say those are going to range from about $1,500 to at the high end $3,000-ish, somewhere in there. And then you're going to have whatever you're going to pay the IRS, the $850 on top of that. So, you're in the ballpark of probably, $2,000 to $4,000 real quick, depending on the state that you're located in.
Okay, you mentioned the cost as a disadvantage. I have one of my churches. They weren't sure what they wanted to do or not. And so I instructed them to go to, and I suggested 2 or 3 attorneys and ask them this one question. What is the disadvantage to filing and be as a church, as a nonprofit corporation?
Exactly.
Okay, now, what are the disadvantages?
Well,
Are there?
Well, I guess that's a great question. I still feel like any disadvantages are overcome by the advantages.
Right.
There are some people who have a very big aversion to going to the state and asking the state for anything. And so that is one of the things that I get the most often is the church saying, hey, we don't want to go to the state and ask them to issue us a nonprofit corporation charter. And it, a lot of times goes back to separation of church and state issues for them. That's probably the number one issue I get. Obviously,
is that valid?
I don't see that is where we go. I think we from a biblical basis, we have that understanding that the government is there in place and it is an authority. I don't think what it does is somehow gives all of the authority to the government and say, oh, you get to now come in and tell us what we're going to do and run our church. I don't think we're doing that. And so I think some of those fears definitely are out there. I'm not saying they're not real, but I do feel like that is not all that sometimes it's made to be.
Okay, now there are some denominations that are incorporated, but the churches that are members of that denomination, some are autonomous, they are not. And they are told that they are protected because the denomination is incorporated.
False.
What do you say about that?
I say false. Because what you have to understand is only as to whatever's coming to, the top level corporation is protected. So if the church is in here and the local sub-chapter of the church is still an unincorporated association, even if they're going to use the 501c3, which happens a lot, even if they're saying, hey, we're using this tax ID number kind of to route the gifts through, theoretically, it doesn't protect against liability. So oftentimes we have this issue of giving that gets kind of commingled and confused with the liability issue. And there's two totally separate, two totally separate things that we have to look at here. And that's what's so important about this and why this decision is so huge. Because yes, you have the giving aspect, and are you a nonprofit corporation? But one of the keys is the liability. And if you don't take care of the liability, I think you've got a bigger stewardship issue than just the giving.
Absolutely. So the question is if a church is sued for negligence, who's going to pay the liability expense, and who's going to be financially responsible? Is it going to be the national organization?
It's going to be the local.
It's going to be the local church.
Exactly.
And the people. So if they're not incorporated, that means individual people.
And that's the scary thing.
That is scary.
Because now we're saying all of the membership is now liable for whatever that judgment is. And so we've now got an issue of stewardship, not just for the church, because the assets of the church are potentially, up for grabs to that judgment creditor, but also all of those assets that individual members would hold.
Okay, here's another issue. So I have a church, and they have a daycare. They're using the same tax ID number. Can you not incorporate the church separately from incorporating the daycare?
Well, I would argue that it should be done that way. And there's two different things to look at. One, you often have to look at, one, you've got liability issues. And
Absolutely.
Two, we have to decide what kind of daycare it is. One of the things which we have
Profit
to,
or
we have to look at, is this something that's generating profit, and is that something that's going to be ultimately still taxable even to the nonprofit entity? Because you can very quickly cross that threshold and cross that line where you're now a for-profit business that's operating under a church.
A nonprofit. Yeah.
And that still has to pay taxes. So you can still have income taxes if you're not careful. So that's one of those places where I definitely recommend seeking counsel on. Absolutely. To make sure that you're not going too far afield from what's happening. And those are definitely risks for the church. If all of a sudden they find out 3 years later that everything they've been making in the daycare is now taxable, and Mr. IRS man's knocking on the door saying pay over the taxes, and you said, wait, I'm a nonprofit, and they said, yes, but you are doing an unrelated business that doesn't go with your nonprofit because it has a different meaning and goal.
Okay, so you come from a legal standpoint. I come from the insurance standpoint. Let's talk about legal liability. So you have a nonprofit, you have a daycare in a church, and things happen.
Exactly.
Negligence, lawsuits are filed, so forth. What effect would that have on the church? From my perspective, from an insurance perspective, we're talking, claims. It could affect your rates, insurance rates in the future. It could actually, I know of cases where some carriers have canceled, and then now you go into the market trying to find insurance. You've been canceled. There's a large claim incurred, and now your rates are doubled if you can get insurance coverage at all.
Exactly.
So my recommendation is to shift the risk and separate the liability risk of the church away from the daycare.
Exactly. And this is something that's often done later. And one of my encouragements is, as leadership in a church, you've got to make that call before it's too late. Because a lot of times you start off with like a Mother's Day Out program, and that I think is fine. You're kind of in the ministry of the church, and you do a couple of days a week, and then all of a sudden it grows, and now we've got hundreds of kids or something in this daycare, and it's its own operation. It's got separate budget items. It's got lots of expenses. It's got big payrolls. You've now got a lot of liability that the church is still assuming, and it just doesn't know what just happened.
So what I've been able to do successfully is have churches separate the daycare away, and there will be a lease agreement between the daycare and the church. So it's really a separate entity, because even the board, the court will look at, well, is the board the same?
We want the board to be different.
Yeah, it's got to be different.
You can still have some of the same controlling people and some cross, a little bit of cross between the two.
Not more
boards.
than 50%.
But you don't want it to be over 50%.
Yes.
You really want to make sure there's some independence on the two entities.
Because one can really affect the other in a very adverse way.
Very much so.
So we've covered some stuff, some very important issues. And so you suggest we got to look at the Constitution, file the proper papers. The church needs to be supportive and vote, to show that in their records. Become incorporated, through the proper entities.
And then file the 501c3.
And then file the 501c3.
And so that's kind of the last part. And I've had people say, we hear a lot in the news, it takes forever to get a 501c3, and it does. I've had some that are well over a year before we get that determination letter. But here's a thing that's not often told. Once you've sent in your application to the IRS and you've sent in your filing fee, you're a 501c3 for that determination period of time. Oh. Which means if you've got 13 months before they send you the letter, until they deny you all of those gifts, all of that is under what would be a provisional 501c3 status. So you've got it from the moment you make that application and pay the fee. So even if it takes 13 months, you really don't care as a church. All you've got to do is make sure all the paperwork's filed and the fees paid.
Is that called due diligence?
Well, the due diligence period for the IRS starts once you send them everything, and some of it's due diligence period, and some of it's just because they're slow. And so you know, one of the things you've got to look at is they only get to it when they get to it, and it depends on the volume and how many people are applying for nonprofit status, and just kind of how their inner workings function. But the key to you is you get it now. And that's the benefit, is you can operate under it. You can say, I filed it. Once we've got that acknowledgement, we know that we're good, and it's just you can continue operating.
Okay, before we close, I want to address one issue. Oftentimes, people will ask me, well, how does the insurance carriers look upon a church that's incorporated? Mm-hmm. They consider the church that's unincorporated, they're not taking care of their business. Okay, and most carriers will give you a discount. It's not major, but they will recognize, the fact that you're incorporated and you're taking care of your business. And I think in this day and time, we need to be very diligent. And here's why: I think any weakness in a church policy and procedure, any weakness in hiring methods, discriminatory methods, any weakness that results in embezzlement, sexual misconduct, background checks, and transportation issues regarding maintenance and so forth. Any weakness, and a weakness could be a church is not incorporated. Then any weakness, the evil one will use that weakness to destroy your church, destroy your ministry, and destroy families, because the world doesn't like the message of the church, and the world wants the church to fail. That's why we do what we do in helping the church get more organized and take care of their business.
And that's what we're all about, the proactive protection of the church, to make sure that the church understands the issues and takes care of business before we run into the issue.
For Travis Story and Mike Russell, thank you so much for being here with us. We hope that this was helpful to you.